Today, we interview economist and journalist Ben Norton about the state of the global economy. Hey, everyone. My name is Jason Smith. I'm originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Joining us today on the bridge to China is journalist and economist Ben Norton. He is the editor of geopoliticaleconomy.com. His journalistic work has been published in dozens of media outlets. He has done interviews on the BBC, Sky News, Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, RT, CGTN, Press TV, HispanTV, and various other TV and new media. Welcome back to the bridge to China, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you. You are very good at explaining things. I think, I've talked to people in the comments under previous interviews. People always say that you're very good at explaining things to people in a way that they can understand. So we have some questions for you today so that you can explain them again or more. So we have Apec Forum coming up, and it's going to be held in Peru. And China, the US, Russia, Mexico, and others are all members. What are your thoughts on what might be accomplished in this very complex group?
Yeah, for people who don't know, APEC is essentially a trade agreement between the countries of Asia and the countries across the Pacific. That's the ANP and APEC. It was created in the late 80s. And this is an important summit that's going to be held in Peru in November. President Xi is attending. And that's because Peru is going to be officially inaugurating a massive port that's known as a super port that was built by China and is operated by the Chinese state-owned shipping company COSCO, not to be confused with the U.S. company Costco with the T. So take out the T, that's the Chinese state-owned shipping company. And the idea is that this is going to accelerate trade between Latin America and China. And there are going to be these ships that go from Shanghai's port all the way across the Pacific to Peru. And there are plans to build other ports in other parts of the western Pacific coast of South America. So this is important, of course, because we've seen that, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been deepening its economic integration with other parts of Asia and with Africa. There's been a lot of focus on Africa. In fact, every year there's an important summit that's held in Beijing discussing deepening Chinese and Africa cooperation, which is called FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Well, APEC is a way of helping to deepen China's trade with Latin America. And of course, China has put a lot of emphasis on this idea of South-South cooperation. And as the United States wages what many people call a new Cold War and tries to cut off Chinese trade, putting tariffs on Chinese products, and the U.S. is pressuring other countries to reduce their trade with China, this is a way for China to diversify its trading networks and deepen its integration with other parts of the global South.
Really quick, there were some politicians in the U.S. that were upset about the port in Peru being built by China, and they referred to, I think this is under the Monroe Doctrine, as Peru as their backyard. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, this shows this colonialist view that is common in the United States, and especially in recent years, we've seen more and more politicians invoke the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine, which essentially says that Latin America belongs to the U.S. empire. It's our imperial sphere of influence. Of course, China doesn't see the world that way as, colonial spheres of influence. China says we want to work together with countries in what it refers to as win-win cooperation for mutually beneficial development. And that's how a lot of people in Latin America also see it. I mean, the irony is that Peru right now actually has a very right-wing pro-U.S. government, but this project, this, super port, is a years-long project. It was not created by the current government, and it's something that people across the political spectrum agree on because they want more trade. China is the world's largest economy when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity, which accounts for differences in exchange rates. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. It produces 35% of global manufacturing output. China makes everything, whereas the U.S. has deindustrialized. What does the U.S. make? I mean, the U.S. designs products and has the intellectual property monopoly, but then those products are manufactured in China. So, of course, people in Latin America want to deepen their trade with China. They don't see this as something political, which is why even right-wing governments in Latin America are willing to trade more and more with China. But the U.S., of course, sees trade as political. It sees all economic agreements as political, and it wants Latin America to be dependent on the US economy. And they know that the more that Latin America trades with China, the weaker US economic dominance over the region will be.
You know, one of the real reasons I had you on is for me to get a personal lesson, and I hope that benefits my viewers as well, because you, despite only having been in China a couple of years, really have a good handle on China's economy. I watched a couple of your videos, and I was like, I've been here 12 years, and you were teaching me things that I had no idea about. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about China's economy, and I want people online to jump in and ask questions in the comments and so forth. But people argue, what is China's economy? Some people are like, oh, China's only successful because it's become capitalist. And other people are saying, well, China's economy is successful because it is socialist. And other people, there's all kinds of different debates amongst us who are not economists, such as yourself. What is the case?
Yeah, well, of course, socialism and capitalism are often not clearly defined. And really, if you even go back to Karl Marx, the main point of socialism is, it was, as Marx put, that every economic system, every mode of production is what he referred to as a dictatorship. But he doesn't mean that in the sense of one dictator. He means that there's a class dictatorship. Capitalism is a dictatorship of the capitalist class. That is, the system is governed by the capitalists. And socialism is a dictatorship of the working class. That is, the system is governed by the working class on behalf of the working class. So socialism and capitalism are really political. They're not just economic. It's a political economy, right? So when we come to looking at trying to analyze any economy in the world, basically every economy in existence has always been mixed, a mixed economy. There's a role of the state and there's the role of private markets and private companies, although that relationship is complicated, right? Because where does the state end and where does a private company begin? It's not this neat division. All private companies operate within a framework that is established by the state. This is true for even any so-called libertarian society. I mean, so there's a kind of spectrum. And the question is, what is the role of the state? How strong is the state? What percentage of the economy is owned by the state and what percentage is owned by private capital? And there's a spectrum in it, and it goes back and forth. And certainly in a country like China, it has changed a lot over the years, right? Even in the United States, which is seen as, the beacon of capitalism, the government still represents a very significant part of spending in overall GDP, and increasingly so as the US is running large deficits of around 6% of GDP, which is a big stimulus for the private sector, right? So let's get to China. Okay. Now, one of the reasons that there's confusion about this is because during the Cold War, basically socialism was taken to mean the Soviet Union. And obviously the Soviet Union only represented one particular model of socialism. And really it was an example of an economy where everything was planned and owned by the state. So 100% planned, 100% state owned. Now, obviously there have been many socialist governments throughout history, and not all of them had 100% state planned and owned economies. They were often much more mixed. And this is especially true for a lot of countries in the global south, like in the anti-colonial movements in parts of Asia and Africa and Latin America. They didn't implement the same model as the Soviet Union, which everything was planned by the state and owned by the state. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or even Vietnam had a different model, right? There were many different socialist projects that were not all the Soviet Union. Now, China initially, when the revolution succeeded in 1949, it did model itself after the Soviet Union. And there were Soviet economists and technicians and engineers who were sent because at that time in the 50s, China and the Soviet Union had very good relations. Now, through the 60s, those relations broke down through the famous Sino-Soviet split. And then also after the death of Mao in 1976, there was a reform period that began in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping in China. And China did allow some market forces, and the state no longer planned everything and owned everything, and it's experimented since then. So that doesn't mean that China is no longer socialist. It just means that it's no longer following the particular Soviet model, which again, many other socialist countries did not follow either. There is a variety, right? Again, socialism is ultimately more of a political question than just an economic one. This is a question of political economy. So throughout the period, the socialist period in China, there was a big debate about what the model should be. One of the things that, for instance, China emphasized more than the Soviet Union was communes, right? In the Soviet Union, it was very much the state owns everything. There was an attempt in agriculture to have maybe some elements of communes, but not nearly as much as in China, whereas the Communist Party of China always emphasized that you can have, so if you want to move away from private ownership of capital and the means of production, you can have state ownership, but you can also have communal ownership in the form of communes, especially in rural areas. Not only agriculture, but other rural cooperatives who can have small scale production of textiles and furniture and things like that, that don't need a lot of capital, a lot of machinery in order to produce these goods, and they can be collectively owned by the community. That was something that was very emphasized during the Mao period. Still today, there are cooperatives, especially agricultural cooperatives in China. And in fact, in recent years, the government of President Xi has emphasized the resurgence of agricultural cooperatives that have the support of the state. They receive seeds and fertilizer and machinery from the state, but they're not state-owned. They're owned collectively by the community. Okay, now in the 70s, in 1978 into the 80s, with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, China experimented with privatization of some parts of the economy. So saying that, why do we need to have everything state-owned and planned? I mean, instead, for instance, why do we have like all of these hotels and restaurants that are state-owned? We can allow them to be privately run by, small businesses. We're not so concerned. They're not strategic for the overall direction of the economy. And there was a debate about how this should be done. It was not, there's this impression that China just had massive privatization of everything. That is not at all in any way what happened. Like in the former Soviet Union in the 90s, which was a complete disaster. There was mass privatization of all of the state-owned enterprises, and they were often sold off for pennies on the dollar by corrupt government officials backed by Western neoliberal economists, when there was this period of what was known as shock therapy imposed on the former Soviet Union. According to UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, they did a report after a decade of the neoliberal shock therapy, and they found that millions of people died in that period, especially in Russia. That the average life expectancy in Russia fell by 6 to 8 years. It was the largest collapse in living standards outside of war in modern history. Those are the kinds of collapses that you usually see when there's a massive war. Well, this is what happened to the former Soviet Union, not only to Russia, but also Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union, right? China did not experience that. In fact, China very much learned from that experience and said we should not do what was done to the former Soviet Union. We can experiment with partial liberalization. However, we're not going to just privatize everything. And there's a very good book about this by an economist named Isabella Weber, and it's called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. Now, in the 80s and 90s, China experimented with also allowing in some foreign investment. However, it did so under very strict conditions. It was not simply any foreign company can come here and open a factory and exploit Chinese workers. No, because the goal was to develop the productive forces, as Deng Xiaoping famously said. He pointed out that China was very poor when the revolution happened in 1949, and still in the 70s, China was very poor compared to the advanced economies of the West, which of course developed through colonialism and slavery. China didn't develop through colonialism and slavery, unlike the US, which also developed through mass ethnic cleansing of the indigenous peoples and taking all their they had all this free land that they stole from the indigenous peoples, right? China didn't have that, right? So China said we were really behind, we need to catch up. So in order to catch up, we need technology. The most important element of foreign investment was not necessarily the investment itself, which is known as foreign direct investment, FDI. FDI was always a very small percentage of overall fixed capital formation in China, which is overall investment. The vast majority of investment was done nationally, locally, by companies and by the state through state-owned banks, because the banking system was never privatized. It still remains state-owned today. And the state-owned banks would give favorable loans to create factories and industries in strategic sectors, which, by the way, is also how Japan industrialized. It's how South Korea industrialized. It's how Singapore industrialized. It's how Taiwan province industrialized, through the state giving loans to strategic sectors with low interest rates. And in the case of mainland China, they did foreign investment on the condition that foreign investors would have to operate factories with a Chinese company in what is known as a joint venture. Usually the plan was 51% of the company would be owned by a Chinese firm, and then 49% would be owned by a foreign company. So things like Volkswagen came in and build car factories, right? Or, many other companies. They would come in, they would open a factory, but under the condition that, as Deng Xiaoping said, the arrangement is market access for technology transfer. So market for technology. You get access to this huge Chinese market. You can get access to the big labor market with literally over 1 billion Chinese people who can work in your factories. However, under the condition that we get access to your technology. Now, there's this narrative, there's this myth that some Western critics of China have used today, claiming that China supposedly forced companies to give them the technology. They refer to this as technology theft or intellectual property theft, which is false. It was not theft. It was voluntary. There are even some mainstream Western scholars who have admitted this. The condition was, we will allow you to invest. You will make a lot of money investing. Foreign companies did get very wealthy doing this. But as a condition, you must form a joint venture and you must share your technology. It was not forced. It was voluntary technology transfer. So this is how China was able, also through its own innovation. China has made enormous progress. It has literally tens of millions of engineers and scientists. And the education system in China has developed, and it's now one of the best in the world. If you look at international journals, scientific journals, top Chinese universities now represent the majority of the contributions to these advanced scientific journals. So China has made a lot of progress. It wasn't just because of the foreign investment, but the technology transfer was an important part of this. So essentially, China did allow some liberalization and some private companies to operate, but it was not a complete abandonment of socialism. It was the recognition that you can have a market socialist system. So China refers to this as a socialist market economy. That's the official name that was adopted under the previous president, Jiang Zemin. And in Deng Xiaoping referred to it as socialism with Chinese characteristics. So he said that each society has its own unique history, its own material conditions, its own advantages and disadvantages. They shouldn't just copy another model like the Soviet model. China should implement its own unique form of socialism according to its own conditions, which is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And then again, later under Jiang Zemin, it was named a socialist market economy. And also Vietnam has undergone a similar reform process, and Vietnam refers to its system as a socialist-oriented market economy. And finally, one other quick point. So there was privatization that went on, and under Jiang Zemin, that privatization it followed a strategy that was known as grasping the large, letting go of the small. What that means is that the biggest, most important sectors of the economy remained in state hands. They're still state-owned today. And about 1/3 of Chinese GDP comes from state-owned enterprises, SOEs. But even there, people say, well, it's only 1/3 of the economy. Yeah, that's true. However, it's the most important third of the economy, which includes, first of all of the banks in China are state-owned, the major banks that are used, and they are the ones that are used to industrialize, right? Because these big companies rely on cheap, favorable loans from the banks. So in many ways, the banks control the companies. Then all of the land in China is still technically state-owned. And then the state leases that land to be used, but it's still state-owned. Furthermore, if you look at the other sectors, where are the SEOs concentrated? In infrastructure construction, which is very important, obviously, because that's what you need to actually develop your economy, to build roads and schools and hospitals and bridges and tunnels, which China has done at an incredible pace through state-owned enterprises. Also, the telecommunications infrastructure is owned by a big three companies, China Telecom and these other companies. And then China can, because they're state-owned, they can offer very affordable internet and phone plans. As you know, I mean, it's like a few dollars every month with the exchange rate. It's nothing compared to, like, you look at these monopolies, these private monopolies in a country like the United States, where people pay easily $100 a month for their cell phone plan. So that's state-owned as well. And then you also have the energy grid. Electricity is done by a state-owned company. So this, and then now we also see the railroads, right? The massive construction of railroads and high-speed rail, that's also done by state-owned enterprises. So yes, China did allow private companies to operate, hotels, restaurants, technology companies, because that competition can be helpful for innovation in certain sectors, right? Like, you don't want people to compete to see necessarily who can, like, for instance, in private education, you don't want this kind of inequality to emerge where you can have more and more expensive private education, which only rich kids can get, but it's the best education. That's an example of competition being bad for society, because you want everyone to have equal access to public education. And China has cracked down on private tutoring to make sure that poor kids have access to just as good education as rich kids, right? So that's an example of where you don't want competition. But it is good to have competition in something like car companies, right? Because then you have these companies that are competing with each other to reduce the cost as much as possible to make very affordable cars, which is one of the reasons why China has insanely cheap electric vehicles. They've gotten support from the state as well. So China basically said, okay, we'll allow competition and private companies to operate in certain sectors that are not strategic necessarily, but the state will remain the owner of the most important sectors of the economy. And that relationship can change over time, right? So in the 90s, it was moving more toward private companies, but in the past decade, it's the share of the economy has moved back towards state-owned enterprises. So it goes back and forth.
That's very thorough. Thank you. I want to talk about the Mao era really quickly. A lot of people who dislike socialism, dislike China's economic model, they point to the Mao era and say that all kinds of horrors went on during that time. Could you speak to any kinds of successes that went on during Mao's era after 1949?
Yeah, well, the official position of the Communist Party of China was that Mao was 70% correct and 30% incorrect. This was adopted in the Party Congress in 1981. So the official position of the Communist Party is obviously Mao made mistakes. Every leader makes mistakes. But what's funny is that you look at the United States and U.S. politics, no one can ever say anything bad about George Washington. He's like, oh my God, he was the founding father. Not to mention, he was a slave owner. He oversaw slavery. He oversaw mass ethnic cleansing and mass killings of indigenous peoples. I mean, you're not allowed to say any of that. So there's this idea that, the founding father of a country, the U.S., is perfect. And China has said our founding father made some mistakes. I mean, so they're actually more responsible and more, they engage in more self-criticism than the United States does, right? Don't talk about Thomas Jefferson, don't talk about George Washington. So obviously, yeah, there were mistakes made in the Mao era, but at the same time, what Mao accomplished was absolutely amazing. Think about this. Before 1949, China was a country that was partially colonized by foreign powers through what was known as the Century of Humiliation. China was partially colonized. The foreign powers, for instance, the French and the British, invaded. They burned down the Summer Palace in 1860. You can go visit the old Summer Palace still, and you can see the ruins that were destroyed by the European invaders. Then famously in 1900, you have the 8-nation alliance. These 8 foreign countries invade, and they take over Beijing. And then they impose throughout this period that's known as the Century of Humiliation, which really goes back to 1839 with the First Opium War. And then through the Second Opium War in the 1850s and leading to 1860, through that period, the foreign powers invade China. They colonize parts of China. The British Empire colonizes Hong Kong and Macau. They try to take over the port of Guangzhou. And then, of course, the Japanese Empire colonizes parts of China, including Taiwan, that had been part of China for hundreds of years. They colonize Manchuria. So this is a country that has thousands of years of history, but through the century of humiliation is colonized. And then the colonial powers impose the unequal treaties. So in the famous 8-nation alliance invasion of China, they impose an arrangement that says that China has to pay reparations to the invaders that is equal to more than all of the tax revenue that the Qing dynasty had achieved. So, I mean, it's like what the IMF does to countries today, right? They can never pay off this debt. But this is what was done to China through the unequal treaties. So this is a country that was colonized, carved up, broken up, divided. There were warlords. So what the Communist Party of China did was amazing. They, through this very long, arduous process, through the Long March, through the Civil War, through fighting the Japanese imperialists who invaded and colonized China, the communists in alliance with the nationalists, they expelled the Japanese invaders. And then after the end of World War II, in which 10 to 20 million Chinese died, which are never mentioned in the Western discussion of World War II, right? They make it all about the West, and maybe they'll mention the Soviet Union, which did the vast majority of the fighting against Nazi Germany. 27 million Soviets died compared to 400,000 Americans and 400,000 Brits. Even if you're lucky, if they'll acknowledge the Soviet Union's contribution. But almost no one mentions China's contribution to fighting the Japanese Empire. 10 to 20 million Chinese lose their lives. The war ends in 1945, but it actually continues with the Civil War, right? And finally, the very corrupt nationalists are forced out of power. They flee to Taiwan, and the communists take over in 1949 on the 1st of October. I mean, what they accomplish is amazing. And then they're not even done, because then they have to deal with the warlords, because China was still divided. So unifying China after hundreds of years of civil war and colonialism and warlords, that's absolutely amazing. This is why Mao Zedong is rightfully seen by people in China as this hero who unified the country. He kicked out the foreign imperialists, and he created China, modern China, and deserves a lot of credit for that. And even throughout the Mao period, although obviously there were a lot of mistakes that were made, for instance, in the Great Leap Forward, people say, Western academics are very political, of course, and there are a lot of Western scholars who intentionally inflated the number of deaths for political reasons, just to gross proportions. It's ridiculous. Obviously, there were a lot of mistakes that were made. The Communist Party of China has acknowledged that through these periods. But let's keep in mind that China, which has thousands of years of history, for thousands of years, it had famine after famine after famine. And on average, there are scholars who estimate that for about 3,000 years, there was a famine on average every 2 years in parts of China. Literally hundreds of millions of people in China died throughout history from famines. And the last famine that happened in Chinese history was during the Great Leap Forward. And again, there were mistakes that were made, killing all of the birds that they were trying to, as part of this process, they were trying to kill these swallows, these birds who were destroying their crops. So they killed the birds, but then they also ended up hurting the other parts of the ecosystem. Again, the Communist Party has acknowledged that mistakes were made. But that was the last famine that happened in thousands of years of Chinese history. And now China is, not only does it have enough food, but the joke is people in China say that we have too much food and we're trying to lose weight after thousands of years of famines, right? So the fact that China was able to do that is amazing. And then we need to keep in mind that China, when the revolution happened in 1949, life expectancy was around 32 years. Think about that. The average person in China before the revolution lived only until 32. Both of us would be dead years ago, right? I mean, so like this is, when Mao died in 1976, despite all of the difficulties of that period, when he died in 1976, life expectancy was more than double. It was like 64, depending on what estimate you look at. So they doubled life expectancy throughout that period, despite all of the difficulties. And China also did very basic industrialization. So the whole point of the Great Leap Forward was to go from what they referred to as a backward agricultural society to an advanced industrialized society. And obviously they didn't make mistakes, but it was an attempt to industrialize China and make it an advanced power that could produce steel, that could make roads, that could build factories. And that was obviously a long and complex process. And it's still a process that countries like India are going through. And every single year in India, there are hundreds of thousands of people who suffer from malnutrition, and many die. In fact, millions of people who suffer from malnutrition. But depending on what estimates you look at, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people every single year in India who die. And there is a famous Indian economist, Amartya Sen, who pointed out that India has had many more millions of people who died from hunger and malnutrition throughout the past several decades since India's independence from British colonialism in 1947 than in China. Even if you take the most ridiculous, egregious estimates by Western anti-communist scholars who are trying to, add zeros to the death toll in China to make it seem, worse than it actually was. So it's difficult, of course, to parse, to pick apart all of the Western propaganda from the reality. But like I said, the Communist Party of China has officially said that 70% of what Mao did was correct and 30% was incorrect. They acknowledge the errors, and they've gone a long way to trying to, compensate for the errors that were made in that period. And now China is one of the world's largest food producers. China has the world's most advanced infrastructure. It has now some of the best technology in the world that is advancing very quickly. So, there is an attempt by some people to say that Deng Xiaoping completely broke with Mao. That's not true. He did break with he did change some of the elements of Mao, especially the idea that all of the economy should be planned by the state and owned by the state. So that was a difference. But the Communist Party has always emphasized that it's building on the foundations that was set by every leader. So Deng Xiaoping was setting on the foundations built by Mao, changing some things, but still the most of what was set continued. And then Jiang Zemin continued what was built by Deng Xiaoping. Hu Jintao continued what was built by Jiang Zemin, and now Xi Jinping has continued as well.
Absolutely fascinating. I wanted to ask about this is, I guess, not as important as the other questions, but there's a debate whose economy is bigger between the United States and China that goes on online every day. And there's measuring by purchasing power parity, and there's other measurements as well. Most Western media claims the U.S. economy is larger than China's constantly. You see that the world's second largest economy constantly in headlines practically every day when referring to China. Is that accurate?
Well, first of all, we have to ask what GDP represents. Officially, gross domestic product is the value of all goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. Okay, fine. But GDP has different sectors, right? So there's industrial manufacturing, the service sector, there's healthcare, education, and government spending. So government spending is part of GDP. If the government spends more and more and more, that can help the economy grow. The U.S. is a good example of this. So in 2024, the estimate is that U.S. GDP growth is about 3% of GDP. But the U.S. federal deficit is 6% of GDP. So the U.S. government debt is growing faster than the economy is. It's not necessarily bad to have government debt. I mean, China has government debt as well. But you have to ask if that government debt is being used in order to productively grow the economy. So if government debt grows, but then the economy grows faster, that's fine. So I'm not saying that, we should be like these neoliberal economists who say that you should have no government debt. But the point is that the U.S. economy is built in a certain way where, yes, it's growing and it's big, but we have to ask what is growing and why is it big? So about 17% of U.S. GDP consists of healthcare. The U.S. on average spends twice as much on healthcare as a percentage of GDP than all other advanced economies in the OECD. And yet it has worse results. Look at healthcare. The healthcare system in the US is a nightmare. Anyone who has dealt with it can see this. First of all, it's all done by private insurance companies who charge you an arm and a leg, and then when you actually have to go to the hospital, they don't want to pay for anything. I mean, for an example, when I was living in the US over a decade ago, and I was riding my bike, and I got hit by a car in a hit and run, and I was taken to the hospital, to the ER, and I had blacked out. I woke up and I was in the hospital. I wasn't even, conscious during the ambulance ride. And when I was there overnight. I got some stitches in my head, and I was there for one night for about 20 hours. I went home the next day, and then over the next few months, I got like 7 bills in the mail from different companies, because the ambulance belongs to one company, the doctor worked for one company, the nurse worked for another company, the medicine was billed to one company, the X-ray was billed to another. I got 7 bills, and it came to like $25,000. Insane, just outrageous fees. I mean, think about, and that's one small example. Imagine if you get cancer. The most common cause of bankruptcy in the United States is because of medical bills. And among the largest medical bills, it's often cancer. So you have many people in the US who go bankrupt because they get cancer. And they have health insurance, but they have millions and millions of dollars of hospital fees. So that contributes to GDP. The more that a hospital charges, the more that an insurance company charges, that contributes to GDP growth, which is a big reason why healthcare represents 17% of US GDP. You know what represents about 22% of US GDP is what's known as the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. So when banks charge more fees, GDP goes up. When insurance companies charge more fees, GDP goes up. When lawyers charge more fees, GDP goes up. So you have more divorces happening in the US, right? And then you have divorce lawyers who charge more and more fees. GDP goes up. So does GDP actually make your society better off? Not necessarily. We have to ask, in what sector is that GDP growing? If you look at manufacturing share of US GDP, it has been stagnant and declining. It's about 10%. Look at China, on the other hand. It's the exact opposite. The whole point of China's economy is they want to reduce the costs of things like healthcare and education, telecommunications, transport. That's why the state owns many of these sectors of the economy. It can keep them very low cost. And then the way that China thinks about it is they say, okay, fine, yeah, our telecommunications and infrastructure are owned by the state, and they're run by SOEs that are not super profitable, because their goal is not to make transportation as expensive as possible, because other parts of the economy use transportation and they want to minimize the cost of transportation so car companies can build cars more cheaply. They want to minimize the costs of telecommunications so technology companies can minimize the cost of production. So they're not charging an arm and a leg, they're not paying an arm and a leg to Verizon or whatever, right? So China thinks about the economy in a different way. And in particular, in recent years, the Chinese government has emphasized what they call high quality growth. It's not just growth for growth's sake. Now, China had amazing GDP growth in the past few decades, breaking all records in human history for the amount of GDP growth. It's amazing. A lot of that GDP growth was in infrastructure, right? Which, if you look at China's infrastructure today, it's the best in the world. If you compare it to the US, you really have to ask which country is the advanced, developed country and which is the developing. Now, of course, China is a huge country with 1.4 billion people, and there are still provinces that are not as developed as, if you go to Beijing, if you go to the big cities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, which a lot of foreigners go to, right? So there still are parts of China that very much are developing and catching up. But the point is that China throughout this period was developing incredibly rapidly, and a lot of this was driven by infrastructure growth. However, they dealt with the problem where they had a big real estate bubble. You get to a point where you no longer really need to build more roads and more airports because you have enough in the big cities. They're working now on like the less developed areas, right? So they still have some. But the government decided we need to pop this real estate bubble and reduce the costs of housing because, of course, housing should be for living in, not for speculation, as President Xi said. And instead of emphasizing growth in that sector of the economy, we're going to emphasize growth in what are known as the new high quality productive forces. That's the phrase that's used. So this means semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels, new technologies. This is what they're emphasizing. And China is doing this very well. So they're changing the direction of their economic growth. And that means that now they're growing about 5%, which is still very good. I mean, again, the US is growing 3% with this massive deficit. China is growing 5%, which is much bigger. And look at Europe. Most countries in Europe either have no growth or some of them are even entering recession. So China is still growing very well, and it's growing in sectors that actually are tangible products that people want to have better lives, not just lawyers charging you more money. It's funny, I talked to someone at Peking University who's doing a master's in law, and he was complaining about how lawyers in China make so little compared to, he lives in London. This is a British friend of mine who is studying. And he's like, man, in London, we make like 10 times more than the lawyers here in China. And you think about it, well, it's like, okay, well, that shows that China actually has a society that better compensates more important sectors of the economy, not lawyers who are, in many ways in the US, we see, lawyers are kind of parasitic, right? So we have to look at GDP as a whole. And then finally, let's get back to the most basic fundamental question, which is whose GDP is bigger? Because at the end of the day, like I said, I mean, it's not that important of a question. It's more symbolic than anything, because even if the US has a bigger GDP, which by the way, it does not, it doesn't matter if a lot of that GDP comes from bank fees and lawyer fees and health insurance. When it comes to actually producing things like food or manufactured products like semiconductors, the US can't really do it, which is why the US is putting all these tariffs on China, right? So let's get back to the issue of whose GDP is bigger. Well, what a lot of mainstream economists do is they measure GDP in nominal terms. What does that mean? So the US government every year reports its GDP figures in dollars because the dollar is the US currency. China reports its GDP figures in renminbi because they use yuan. They don't use dollars domestically in China. So what a lot of economists do is they take the Chinese figures in yuan or the Russian figures in rubles or the Indian figures in rupees, and then they simply convert all of that to dollars at the current exchange rate, whatever the exchange rate is now. But that exchange rate fluctuates. So, for instance, if you look at a country that has an inflation crisis like Venezuela, it looks like Venezuela's GDP shrank by, I don't know, it's like 50%. But a lot of that is because of the exchange rate, because the Bolivar has lost so much value because of the US sanctions. It's very complicated, right? It doesn't mean that necessarily that all of that manufacturing potential and all the services disappeared. It means that their value compared to the dollar has fallen substantially. So in a country like China, if the renminbi falls significantly against the US dollar, it can look like the Chinese economy has shrunk or it's not growing as quickly. But that's because of the exchange rate. And this does not take into account the purchasing power of the currency. So if you have yuan and you're in China and you want to go down and buy a bowl of noodles, you can get a bowl of noodles usually for what? 12 yuan, depends where you are. In some places even cheaper, in some places more. Maybe let's be very generous and let's say 20 yuan, which is more expensive noodles, right? 20 yuan, that's less than $3. If you were to buy the same bowl of noodles in the US, depending on where you are, it would easily be $10, maybe $20 if you're in New York City, right? So that means that you can buy 3 times as many or more, 3 to 5 times as many bowls of noodles in China for the same amount as you can buy in the United States. And yet, if you simply just convert yuan to dollars, you do not take into account the difference in the purchasing power of your currency, right? Here's another example. How much do people pay for education in the US? Well, in a private university, it's like $60,000 a year now and getting more expensive every year. Whereas in China, if you're a Chinese national, it's free. Even if you're a foreigner and you're going to the top Chinese universities, you'll still probably pay a few $1,000s for 1 year of tuition. So US tuition is in the most generous circumstances, if we're looking at a foreigner studying in China, US tuition is probably 30 times more. So we have to find a way to judge the purchasing power of the currency in China. And the way that economists do that is they use a basket of different goods and services. So food, energy, certain services like healthcare and education, they put that all into what they call a basket, and then they judge the purchasing power of a currency. And then every year they change that depending on the value of the goods and services in that basket. And if you look at China's GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, PPP, it's way larger than the US. And every single year, China's economy is growing more and more. So according to the most recent data from the IMF, which came out this October, China's economy now represents 19% of global GDP, and the US economy represents 14%. And US economy is, its share of global GDP is falling, and China's share of global GDP is increasing over time.
That's a very thorough explanation. Thank you. I wanted to talk about China's SOEs again. You did a very thorough job, but a lot of people criticize China's SOEs as unprofitable. So China's SOEs are criticized as unprofitable. I mostly hear this about high-speed rail in China. Yet 70% of Chinese companies in the global Fortune 500, according to you, actually, I got this from one of your videos, are Chinese SOEs. How can people who are trying to understand China understand this better?
All right. Well, first of all, when people claim that SOEs are not profitable, that's actually false. Most of the SOEs are profitable. What they're really saying is that they're not as profitable as private companies. Those are two very different things, right? Because again, what I emphasize is that the goal of the SOEs is not to maximize net income, not to maximize profit. The goal is to provide tangible services and goods and infrastructure that are used for the rest of the economy to reduce the costs of production in other parts of the economy. So here's an example. Let's say China were to privatize all of its railroads, which Margaret Thatcher did in the UK, which previously had been nationally owned, right? So in China, a lot of the SOEs are concentrated in what economists refer to as the natural monopolies. These are parts of the economy where you can't really have competition, because how do you have competition for railroads? I mean, you have the railroads. Like, how are you going to build a separate set of railroads? Like that would be stupid. It would make no sense. It would be very inefficient. So you have one set of railroads, and it's operated by a company. What the British did is they actually, Margaret Thatcher privatized the most profitable parts of the railroads, and the least profitable parts are still run by the government. So the government loses money, but the private companies make money, which is obviously the worst of both worlds. What China did is the exact opposite. In the era under Jiang Zemin of grasping the big, letting go of the small, they did privatize some SOEs that were very unprofitable and that were not very strategic. So there were some, I mentioned, the classic example is like hotels and restaurants that were state-owned. But there were also, to be fair, there were some factories that were producing consumer goods and furniture, TVs and stuff that were privatized because they were not profitable. And the government decided, like, these are not strategic. We don't need the government to make, TVs and furniture. There still are SOEs, by the way, in certain industries like cars. So they're like Chery is a famous state-owned Chinese car manufacturer. Like there still are some, and then there are some other, different state-owned enterprises that operate in different, like I think Guangzhou has like a big car manufacturer. So there still are some SOEs in those different sectors. And what they do is they actually compete with the private car manufacturers. So, I mean, they still exist, but most of the SOEs, if you look, for instance, the Fortune 500, the biggest companies in China are SOEs, and they tend to be concentrated in infrastructure, telecommunications, mining, metalworking, for instance, steel production, which is very important, is done by state-owned enterprises. Those are the things that are needed to provide what are known as public goods, right? Because, like, how do you have competition with private production of tunnels and private production of roads? These are natural monopolies, right? It's natural for one company to do this, for one monopoly. Therefore, it's better to have that being done by a state-owned company instead of having a private company that just ratchets up the costs, right? So what happens in the US is you have privatization of the electrical grid and telecommunications, and you have these monopolies, and then they just ratchet up the costs. They charge monopoly rents. This is what's happening in the UK. The UK privatized its water grid, and they have some of the worst water quality of advanced economies, full of sewage. They pumped it full of sewage. And then they have some of the highest costs. So you have the worst results with the highest cost because you privatize the natural monopolies, and you have these companies, they have no competition, so they have no incentives to increase the quality of their services, and they're a private company, so they want to maximize their profits. So in China, you have SOEs that they provide these services, but they're not doing it to maximize their profits. They're doing it to provide services, which is why in China, the electricity is so insanely cheap. I mean, you know this. I know this because I live in China. I pay like every month. I think I pay like $3 or something when you exchange in U.S. exchange rates, like 20 yuan for my electricity. The gas is like, I think I pay like 5 yuan. It's like nothing because the gas is also overseen by state-owned company. The water is like $1. It's like 7 yuan a month. I mean, it's basically free. And they do this so that average people, working people who do not have big incomes, they get basically almost free water, gas, electricity. And then, of course, I pay, I think I get 20 gigs of data on my phone plan, and I think I pay like 18 yuan, which is like $2.50 every month. So the reason that they can do that is because they're done by SOEs. Yes, they're not as profitable as if Verizon did that, because Verizon would charge you $50 a month and not $2 a month. But you have to ask, what are the consequences of that? Yeah, they would be more profitable, but then other, not only average people, but other companies, they have services. So basically every company pays China Telecom for their telecommunication services. Every company pays the Chinese electrical grid for their electricity. So if China has SOEs that can minimize the cost of production, even though they're not maximizing profits, they still are reducing the cost of production that have positive benefits for the rest of the economy. This is what's known in economics as a public good. And it shouldn't be controversial to say that the government should provide public goods, but in the governments used to do this, even in capitalist societies in the West, in the Keynesian era, right? In the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It used to be uncontroversial that the government should provide all these services. But in the neoliberal era, Margaret Thatcher said there's no alternative. We should privatize all of this. And we've seen this happen in so many Western economies in recent decades to disastrous results.
Well, that is actually, I think I'm going to have to watch that a few times. That's a lot of information. It's really useful and a really great way to understand China and maybe some of the things that we can do back home. I want to talk about a couple last things. We don't have a lot of time. China does not seem to experience booms and busts. Even China had this massive deflation of its housing, its real estate market, and yet things are moving along here in China pretty well by comparison to the United States in 2008. Why is this so?
Well, first of all, because China's growth has been so massive that instead of having a bust, it just has a slightly smaller boom, right? Because when you're growing at, like in the 80s and 90s, when you're growing at double-digit GDP growth per year, let's say one year you grow 13% and the next year you grow 8%. Well, I mean, that's a pretty significant change, but it's not really a bust because you're still growing so fast. So because China had such high growth rates, you didn't have any busts at all. However, it's not just because of that, obviously. It's also because of the financial system being state-owned. So this is so important because what causes busts? Well, especially in a financialized economy like the U.S., let's look at what happened in the past few decades. You had so with the deregulation of the banking, the financial system, and the end of Glass-Steagall. So Glass-Steagall is a law that goes back to the 1930s, I believe 1933, under the New Deal, under FDR. And this, of course, is during the Great Depression. And the U.S. government passed laws that put a big wall in between investment banks and commercial merchant banks. So you have banks that provide and savings accounts for average people, right? So if you're a company or a small business and you need a loan to expand or whatever, or you want to buy a house, you get that. You go to a bank and you get a loan, right? That's a normal commercial bank or a merchant bank. There's also investment banking. Investment bankers take deposits, they take wealthy people's money, and then they invest it in stocks and bonds and other assets to increase the returns for their wealthy investors, right? For their wealthy clients. There was a wall created between those banks, which would prevent the average commercial banks from using all of the deposits of average people and businesses and then gambling it on Wall Street. However, what happened is that throughout the neoliberal era, slowly Glass-Steagall was eroded, and then officially in the 90s, it was ended under the Bill Clinton administration. Although basically it was toward the end of the Nixon administration, then going into the Carter and then the Reagan administration, it was basically made irrelevant, and then it was officially killed by Clinton. Immediately after that happened, what do we see? A massive bubble emerges that leads to the dot-com bubble that bursts in the early 2000s, around 2000, 2001. And you have a big recession in 2001, which some people blamed on 9/11, but actually 9/11 was not the cause, really. It was because of the bursting of the dot-com bubble. By the way, this also happened in Japan. Japan, in many ways, even though it didn't have a socialist system, it had a very state-controlled market system that, in fact, throughout the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, it was referred to as a state-led market system. This is famously described by a very mainstream political economist, Chalmers Johnson, in his famous book on the Japanese MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And basically, even though, again, it wasn't socialism, the state used the banks in order to give favorable loans to strategic industries, to develop strategic industries. And basically, you had a system of financial repression where the government controlled the financial industry so it would serve productive ends. And then, actually, South Korea had the same. In fact, South Korea, under the leader Park Chung-hee in the 70s, 60s and 70s, he nationalized all the banks. So in South Korea, all of the banks were state-owned, like in China. And then in the 80s, what happened? Japan deregulated its financial sector and privatized its financial sector, and South Korea privatized its banks as well. And this led to, in Japan, the massive asset price bubble in the 80s, also along with the massive overvaluing of the Japanese yen through the Plaza Accord in 1985. It led to this biggest bubble in history. I mean, insane, where you had a point where the palace in Tokyo, the emperor's palace in Tokyo, the real estate upon which it was built was valued more than all of the real estate in California. I mean, just a joke. Insane asset bubble. This is what happens when you deregulate the financial sector. You get these big bubbles. The same thing happened in Korea, which exploded in the 1997 Southeast Asian financial crisis, which did not affect mainland China. Well, it did affect mainland China, but it didn't have that crisis because, it affected China because China had trade with these other countries in the region that went through a financial crisis, right? But China did not go through a financial crisis. Why is that? China never deregulated and privatized its financial sector. So you look at the US. In 2000, you had a financial bubble. In 2008, you had another financial bubble. And then now we're dealing with what's known as the everything bubble. There are so many problems in the US financial sector. In 2008, it was largely because of the mortgage-backed securities and the securitization of mortgages, and it's very complicated, right? Collateralized debt obligations and all this. So you had this big financial house of cards that was made possible because of the deregulation of the financial sector. And now today you have a lot of problems with, you have a major crisis in commercial real estate, and you have all these banks that are technically insolvent because they invested in all these bonds, whether it's U.S. Treasuries or mortgage-backed securities that have lost value because of rising interest rates. You have a financial crisis below the surface, and the government is really trying to the Federal Reserve is printing all this money to try to keep the dam from bursting, right? So this is because of the deregulation of the financial sector. This is what happens. It's what happened in Japan. It's what happened to other countries. It's what is happening in the U.S. China never deregulated its financial sector. It's still very tightly controlled by the state, which is why, by the way, also it had a real estate bubble. Because when you have rich people in China, what did they invest in? Well, they can't really invest in many financial assets because the financial sector is run by the state. So they had the option of investing in government bonds, which was a very good investment in China, by the way. But of course, that helps the government. It helps keep lending costs low. You had the option of buying Chinese stocks, which was a horrible investment. In the past 30 years, which also shows again how China is socialist, because in the past 30 years, if you were a rich person in China and you invested in the Chinese stock market in a diversified stock market index, you would have lost money in the past 30 years. If you invested in the US S&P 500, you probably would have made, depending on when you invested, like 50 times your investment. If you invested in India, which of course has grown much less than China in the past 30 years, if you had invested in an Indian stock market index, your investments would have increased by 13 times. So China has grown significantly more than India has in the past 30 years, but Chinese capitalists investing in the stock market have lost money. Whereas India has grown much less than China in the past 30 years, but Indian capitalists investing in the stock market had their returns grow by 13 times. So it's because China controls the financial sector. So what happened is that a lot of rich people, they simply invested in real estate. That was a way of holding their wealth, and they bought their 20th apartment. But eventually what happens is that when you have a lot of growth in real estate and you have so many millions of housing units created, people don't necessarily feel that is a big issue, especially because everyone's income is rising. In China, incomes have multiplied by many times in the past few decades. So, when everyone's getting more prosperous, it's not necessarily a big deal. However, when the economy starts to grow a little bit, when economic growth starts to slow a little bit, it's still growing well at 5%, but it's slowing. Then you start having the issue of people feeling if their incomes are not rising as much, they feel they can't afford housing. So the government decided to pop the real estate bubble. So that was the alternative to the financial bubble. But it's because the state controls the financial sector, which prevents these bubbles from emerging that cause the kinds of busts that we've been talking about.
That's extremely illuminating. I thank you for your time. We are out of time. Thank you so much for your time. Ben Norton, where can we find you? It's geopoliticaleconomy.com, and where else?
Yeah. Everyone should go to geopoliticaleconomy.com. You can find all the links there. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can check out Geopolitical Economy Report. It's easy to find. Look it up. And definitely subscribe to this channel first, and then after you can check out my videos and subscribe there. So Jason, thanks for having me. Thanks for giving me a platform to talk about these important topics. Like you said, I mean, the Western media doesn't really describe these issues very well. So I'm sorry for the long answers, but obviously I think it's important to explain these things. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ben.